Professor John Q. Barrett, professor of law at St. John's University in New York, is the Elizabeth S. Lene Fellow at the Robert H. Jackson Center. Professor Barrett puts into perspective Robert H. Jackson.
I think you can be a lawyer, or before that a law student, without running into the words of Justice Robert Jackson and finding something there that's very powerful. He was, by all accounts, the best, or one of the top few writers in the history of the Supreme Court, and his opinions convey that in a very powerful and direct, informal writing style. So it was first his words as a Supreme Court justice, and then as I began to work first as a prosecutor and then as a legal academic, I found that the paths I was interested in kept crossing the paths of this man's life, and it didn't take me long to figure out that he really was, from my view, a central figure of his time, of his century, and that his time is his project, his contribution is much bigger than the 13 years he served on the U.S. Supreme Court. It really is a story of, I think somewhat the history of this country. A farm boy, a public servant, part of the inner circle during the New Deal, the creation of modern government as we know it, part of the creation of modern constitutional law as we know it, and part of the creation of the international legal order as we know it through his work at Nuremberg. So all of that grabbed me very powerfully.
On October 24th, 2001, we were privileged to have 4 of the prosecutors from the Nuremberg trial come to the Robert H. Jackson Center. They are, from left to right, Henry King, Bernard Meltzer, James Conway, and Whitney Harris. Whitney Harris, seen at the prosecutor's table behind Justice Robert Jackson, his secretary Elsie Douglas, and then Whitney Harris. Whitney Harris was responsible for prosecuting Ernst Kaltenbrunner. He was a general in the SS and state secretary for security in Austria, and as Heinrich Himmler's assistant, was responsible for the extermination of millions of European Jews. Here's why Whitney Harris came to Jamestown.
He has to be a hero to me, of course. I think that he is just a truly brilliant, dedicated, honest leader of men. I think that Justice Jackson has to go down as possibly the finest legal writer of the last century. I mean, his composition is incredible. He talked about, did we help him in his speeches? He didn't need any help with his speeches. As far as phraseology is concerned, as far as, he's just an absolute master. So, he's really, and he made a tremendous contribution, I think, to our own civilization in assuming the responsibility of affording the Germans an opportunity to defend themselves after the end of the last war and proving their criminality.
In the upper left-hand corner is Prosecutor Bernard Meltzer. This is the prosecutor's table. Bernard Meltzer prosecuted Walter Funk. He took part in drafting the laws that deprived German Jews of their economic right. In 1938, he was named Minister of Economics, and in 1939, President of the Reichsbank. It was in the vaults of the Reichsbank that the Allies found 72 carloads of gold teeth taken from the mouths of murdered concentration camp inmates. Bernard explains his reaction to the opening statement by Justice Robert Jackson.
In the courtroom, was it?
Just magnificent, just magnificent.
I mean, we know it is now as
No,
a
but
piece
I
of
mean,
literature, but
it
even
just,
that.
it laid the foundation. You see, you gotta remember, the Americans had the conspiracy count.
Right.
So the Americans could wander over the whole field. And Jackson really gave in thumbnail the history of the regime and the aggressions and so on. And, you know, had wonderful phrases. In a way, one hated to cannibalize the talk by quoting a few excerpts, but there's that wonderful statement of 4 nations flushed with victory,
Right.
so on, subordination of power to reason, or but it was electric. It was electric.
Henry King, at age 27, was one of the Nuremberg prosecutors in the proceedings that occurred immediately after Justice Jackson left Nuremberg in 1946. Henry King was responsible for the prosecution of Erhard Milch, who was Hermann Goering's right-hand man. His prosecution ultimately led to a conviction and a sentence. King, together with Whitney Harris and Ben Ferencz, were the non-governmental delegates to the Rome Treaty. Here they discuss Nuremberg and the potential impact of the International Criminal Court.
Now, we have a little committee here for former Nuremberg prosecutors for International Criminal Court. And Henry and I are very supportive of the International Criminal Court. Henry and I were NGO delegates of this committee that I organized at Rome. And we thoroughly support the concept of a permanent International Criminal Court. And I'm very convinced that if Justice Robert Jackson were alive today, we would have a firm spokesman in our corner, somebody that was really persuasive, that really would help us. We're not that important. We're just little people in this world. But I admire Henry. I've always admired him. He's a man of complete integrity, absolute integrity, and he stands for what's right in the world. And I think we're intimate in this degree of friendship.
And Whitney, you're an inspiration to all of us, I think. I like that letter to the president. I couldn't have been better. And it's, you know, we have the, what it's tantalizing is we have a better world within our grasp, but we have to reach for it. And some people who haven't experienced the horrors of war and all that don't want to go there. And but we're going to get there. I'll say that emphatically, we're going to get there. But that's the bond that holds us together, is the fact that there is a better world out there, and we can make it happen.
Yeah, and the other thing is our personal friendship.
Right.
Get a picture of this.
Right.
The rose between two thorns is Nuremberg prosecutor Drexel Sprecher. During the International Military Tribunal, Drexel Sprecher had the unique distinction of presenting the cases against 2 of the defendants. The first defendant was Baldon von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth Movement, who was at 38 the youngest of the Nazi defendants. A vicious anti-Semite, he preached hatred of the Jews to the youth of Germany. As governor of Vienna, he played an important part in deporting Jews from the city. The second defendant was Hans Fritzsche, who was not as important as the other prisoners. He had been a radio commentator and chief of German broadcasting in the propaganda ministry run by Goebbels. It seemed obvious that he was on trial at Nuremberg only because Goebbels was already dead. Fritschie was charged with inciting the German people to wage war, to commit atrocities against Jews and Slavs, and to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity.
I think he was emotionally disturbed by his reputation and all around the Goering examination.
Right.
But I think he soon recovered from that because everybody felt that he was the main pusher to have the war crimes trials. That at the London negotiations in July and August and September of 1945, that he was the main person who got the French and later the Russians to join up with us. He was the #1 man in Nuremberg, in everybody's opinion.
Associate Prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal, Brady Bryson. Lieutenant Bryson had the responsibility of the prosecution of Helmar Schacht. Schacht was an economic wizard. He pledged his loyalty to Hitler in 1936 and has set about to finance the German rearmament, despite restrictions placed on his country's military forces by the Versailles Treaty, which was signed after World War I. Schacht served as the Minister of Economics and President of the Reichsbank through 1939. However, he was opposed to many Nazi policies, including the elimination of Jews from the economic life of Germany. As a result, Hitler had him thrown into the concentration camp for the last 2 years of the war. Here's Brady Bryson.
My strongest feeling about Nuremberg is that its real value was to make to the extent humanly possible, so to speak, make a permanent written record of that terrible period of history. And that it was the history that was valuable. After all, the war was over.
Right.
There wasn't a war to fight. And in a formal sense, we were trying to convict and punish a number of individuals, but they, as people, they really didn't mean anything to us. I felt it was a whole lot more important that the record be made rather than whether or not the person was convicted and whether he was hanged or put in prison for life or where he might be right now. You know, that personal side of it, I thought, was given the primary play in the press. But I thought the really important and valuable thing was the written record that would always be there and that people would always study and make use of. And therefore, what Nuremberg had to teach would go on in subsequent generations because the record was there. The names, including even Bob Jackson's name, would become just a name of some vague identity to maybe members of the bar 2 or 3 generations later.
Right.
But the record would be there and could be completely recaptured. So that was my feeling.
Yeah.
And I was, glad that I've been a part of that.
International Military Tribunal Associate Counsel, Lieutenant Colonel William Baldwin. 29, Lieutenant Colonel William Baldwin was the youngest prosecutor at the podium. Responsible for the prosecution of Hans Frank, a lawyer who became an active and enthusiastic Nazi in the late 1920s. After the German armies overran Poland, Hitler appointed Frank Governor General of Poland. More than any other person, he was responsible for the liquidation and deportation of nearly the entire Jewish population of Poland. During his rule, he sent more than 2 million Poles to Germany. They were used as slave laborers. When he was captured on May 3, 1945, he attempted to commit suicide, but failed. His diary was seized and used as evidence against him. Prior to the trial, William Baldon, who worked for Lieutenant Colonel John Amon, was present during an extraordinary testimony of Rudolf Hess. The idea was Robert Jackson's to try to have Rudolf Hess shake amnesia. So during the course of this testimony, Hermann Goering was introduced to the interrogation. Here's William Baldon's recollection of that extraordinary interrogation.
Your name is Rudolf Hess, yes. You look to the right of this gentleman. At him, pointing to Goering. Yes. Don't you know me, Goering says. Who are you? You ought to know, we've been together for years. That must have been at the same time as the book that was submitted to me this morning. I've lost my memory for some time. It's terrible. Don't you know me? You don't recognize me? Goering was furious. No, but we talked a lot together. Not personally, but I remember your name. We were together. They were both in the Richthofen squadron. Listen, Hess, I was the Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe. You flew to England in one of my planes. Don't you remember I was the Supreme Commander? First I was a Field Marshal and later a Reichsmarshal. Don't you remember? Hess, no. Don't you remember I was made a Reichsmarshal at the meeting of the Reichstag when you were present? Don't you remember that? Yes, no. Don't you remember that the Fuhrer at the meeting of the Reichstag announced in the Reichstag that if something happened to him, that I would be his successor? If something happened to me, you were to be my successor? Don't you remember that? No. You don't remember that? We two discussed that very long afterwards. Yes, this is terrible. The doctors, blah, blah, blah.
And you were there?
Yeah.
At the conclusion of the International Military Tribunal, there were 11 subsequent trials at Nuremberg. The chief prosecutor at the case number 11, the ministry's case, was William Kaming. William Kaming was at the last trial, the ministry's trial, and here are his recollections of Robert Jackson in Nuremberg.
And the legacy, I think, of Mr. Justice Jackson, who was the most towering figure to come out of all the trials, because his words will live in international law and history. But he had a genius for inspiring the best in people as far as their aspirations and vision. And I think the legacy in part is that victors can apply a rule of law. Now, it's been argued by many, not only German nationals, but also a lot of people in this country with hindsight as they sit on their backsides, that it's victor's justice. The fallacy of that is that if Hitler had won, there would be no questions. There would be no justice. There would be no rule of law. No one in Germany has ever challenged, none of the defendants ever challenged the fairness of the trials. But they did not have adequate counsel. Each had at least two. Weizsäcker, for example, had 4. They had the best minds. They had an open trial with a free press reporting every incident, poring over every document. There were no secret documents. There was no secret trial. This was law at its supreme high. It was the first time that an international trial had been held that was on questions of world interest. And as Mr. Jackson himself said, you know, what we write large today, we will be judged by tomorrow, with the poison chalice.
One of the principal photographers of the Nuremberg trials was Ray Diodario. He was there at the international military trial as well as all of the subsequent trials. Ray's book on the trial, published in Germany, is one of the most popular. One of the first photographers to experiment in color photography. Back on your IMT days, and you say, boy, that one day, or that one photo sticks out in my mind.
Yes.
What would it be?
I know. The photo I didn't take.
Okay.
Okay. I've showed you the pictures that I've taken. I've never shown you the pictures I haven't taken. When execution time came, they built 3 scaffolds for them. We had an idea when it was coming. We could hear the nailing, the nailing, the nailing. I thought they were going to build 1 scaffold. They built 3. And they started about 1 o'clock in the morning. And we thought that we were going to take pictures of them after they dropped. We were never called. None of us. None of us. We had been at the Nuremberg trials for 9 months, and they never called us to take those pictures. Why? They got a lieutenant from Frankfurt who came down. He took, I think, 3 pictures of each one on their coffin after they were dead. And he went back to Frankfurt. Today, I am happy I didn't see them. I'm very, very happy that I didn't see them. That's the picture I didn't take.
Mm-hmm. One of the consulting physicians at the Nuremberg trials was Dr. John K. Latimer. He wrote a fascinating book entitled Hitler's Fatal Sickness and Behind the Scenes at the Nuremberg Trial with Dr. John K. Latimer. Here are his reflections on the legacy of Nuremberg.
Well, I think that the thing that is relevant to your mission is the fact that Mr. Jackson came in over the, not exactly the protests, well, the protests of the British and the Russians, and insisted that it be a trial. And up to that time, it wasn't. It was going to be a massacre, a punishment. And the peculiar reasons that he could bring to bear had to do with his authority with the American government, American Army, to the numbers of personnel that it took, hundreds of people, to manage all of that documentation, which has never been done before. And I don't know if it'll be done since, but I think this was the outstanding memory that I had, was how carefully everything was documented for the first time ever. And it did indeed set an example, as Mr. Jackson used to say, for future adjudications of international problems. And it was so massive, and it was so it was done so well, thanks to his authority through our government and using our Army personnel to hundreds of people every day, 200 or 300 people at work sorting or doing this documentation. It's never been done before, and I don't think it's ever been done since, frankly. And I think that was the thing that impressed me.
Verner Von Rosensteil was born in Germany in 1911 to a wealthy landed family. He served in both the Wehrmacht and the U.S. Army. He was trained in law in Germany and in the United States. He analyzed secret files of the German judicial administration after World War II. He translated German witness affidavits and interpreted for Hermann Goering in preparation for the Nuremberg trials. He wrote a book about his days entitled Tales of an American Soldier, From KP Duty to Seeing the Former Nazi Leaders in the Dock at Nuremberg. I'm going to have you close your eyes and you hear for the first time a speech from the podium in the Grand Palace, and it says, "The privilege of opening the first trial in history for the crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated." You have a ringside seat to the opening statement at Nuremberg. What's your reaction?
I sat up there. I had a I had a ticket for the VIP lodge, and I saw Justice Jackson there, and I thought these were the greatest. This was the greatest speech that I had ever heard in my life. It was as if I had been at Gettysburg. The language was the majesty of the English language, and there, in maybe altogether 10 lines, Jackson had said what all of this was all about. And anything after that was actually merely dressing up, because here he had presented what we were there for, and it told us what had to be done, namely that the people who ordered the thing were the one who set it in motion, and they had to answer for their crimes or prove that they had not committed them. I thought this was tremendous.
In 1946, BBC Scandinavian Network sent Lars Ottesen to cover the Nuremberg trials. He reported back on that special time to the Scandinavian countries. Here's his reflection on the legacy of Robert Jackson.
My best impression of him is from what I read about him in London, and how he tried to explain how he was going to put his team together. And of course, today, what he did in Nuremberg was basically to lay the foundation for the fact that no obedience to any military or civilian superior is an excuse for committing war crimes or any other crimes. And I mean, basically, if you look at it, that is the essence of the whole Nuremberg trial. And that was what he, long before the trial, had set as a goal. And he succeeded. And that's, I think that is his greatness. That's what his testament to the world, which is today tested, of course, in the trial in Hague against Milosevic.
Absolutely right. While at Nuremberg, Justice Robert Jackson had a bodyguard. It was Sergeant Moritz Fuchs from Fulton, New York. After the trial, Sergeant Fuchs went into the seminary and became Father Moritz Fuchs. Here he recalls the greatness of his boss at Nuremberg.
It was a very privileged position for me, there's no doubt about that. And I was very well impressed, and I suppose not only my vocation, but my esteem for our country grew by knowing him, because all the things that we learned in school about what our great country we had was sort of embodied in him. He was a good representation of what our American leadership should be. He filled that role very well, I thought. In new territory, you know, in a trial circumstance that nobody had ever envisioned, that he certainly had not. But he rose to the occasion.
In 1958, the only biography to date was published by author Eugene Gerhardt, entitled America's Advocate, Robert H. Jackson. New Deal advocate, Supreme Court justice, Nuremberg prosecutor, always at heart a country lawyer. Eugene Gerhardt on the left, together with his secretary of more than 57 years, Lorraine Wagner, on the right, spent over 8 years corresponding with and meeting Robert Jackson in order to compile this book. Here are their memories.
And in spite of the fact that he didn't go to college and that he, as you, the things that you just mentioned, he rose to the very top of the legal profession, the court. But in addition to that, he, in his writings himself and in his speeches and his articles, the idealism that he possessed, that he was passing on, was, to me, was just wonderful. And I don't think there are people who've gone to college or got degrees and super degrees that can even
Clinton
match
was a Rhodes Scholar.
Jackson's wit and his wisdom and you know, the way he passed it on. I think that was wonderful.
He was genuine. That would be one of the first things I would say about him. When my secretary gets loose, if Barbara gave her the message, we will get her to follow up some of my facts and figures.
Now, did she?
I was a great admirer of Jackson, Greg. He was a Democrat. Not hard. We admire Democrats in upstate New York just like we admire Republicans. It's the man that counts.
Right.
I thought he was a very fair person. There was something Lincoln-esque about him. You felt you were dealing with the real article. It wasn't the kind of reaction you have against certain Washington politicians today that you don't know whether they're telling you the truth or not, but whatever it is, it's the truth that serves them best, not to find out what the facts are. And Jackson liked genuineness, and I admired that in him. He also got ahead because, being a Democrat, he was also an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. At the time, Dad was a Republican, so I was, by inheritance, a Republican. I heard it all around the table. And so the thing I admired about Jackson was he stood for fundamental decencies. I ran across a quotation which I keep reciting to my grandsons. I have 3 Eagle Scout grandsons. That's not bad, all in one family. And I tell them, you know, nobody's going to save the world. I said, but read Washington's farewell address, which was read but never spoken by him as a speech. And in it he said, how can we expect the people to support this Constitution if we don't believe in it ourselves? He said, erect a standard for the people to which the wise and the good can repair, go back to. And that's what he did. And we're still following it along pretty well. Then Washington, the rest is in the hands of God, and I think that's true. I really do. But Jackson was the kind that could win the respect of a Republican lawyer because he was an honest, decent, fine man who stood for the fundamental decencies of life.
Dr. Arnold Joseph joined the U.S. Army shortly after coming to America. He was 18 years old in 1945 when he was assigned to the International Military Tribunal as censor of prison mail at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg. And there he had an opportunity to read the mail from the prisoners who were on the dock at the trial known as Nuremberg. Here are his reflections.
Germany and coming here, what was it like going back?
Rather exciting and kind of a surprise, because here I was, an adolescent immigrant boy, most of whose family had been exterminated, and here I was not only going back to Germany, but going to the trials. So I can't say I felt it was a feather in my cap, but it was a privileged position to observe things from that vantage point. And I learned a lot, and I evolved a lot, and in the intervening years, I'm still evolving.
How so?
Well, at the time, I was like the Russians, like Churchill. I thought these people should be hanged or shot or done away with immediately, and not just these people, but the generic group called Germans. And as the years passed, and I got a little older and a little wiser and went to college and read some people who really knew how to think, I developed a more magnanimous attitude. I'm against the death penalty. Although, as I point out in my talk, I haven't forgiven anyone, because I think forgiving is really not as a God-like endeavor. And besides, no one's asked me for forgiveness. No, I haven't forgotten either. And in these days, people should remember, because there's no end to it. And I hope talks like mine and what the Jackson Center is doing in part will somehow, if not eliminate, but somehow mitigate and make less frequent these scourges of killing.
Senator John Dellaboy was born December 4th, 1918 in Luxembourg. In 1931, he came to Akron with his father and began a fascinating life journey. After graduating from Miami University in 1942, he joined the Army. And there he was part of the military intelligence. He assisted in the interrogation of the Nazi war criminals prior to the Nuremberg trials. He had an opportunity to interview Goering, Donitz, Ribbentrop, and many others, and has a unique experience as being one of only 5 members of the U.S. Army intelligence interrogation units. Here is his reflections.
Jackson, I think the challenge was, and he explained that to us in a speech on the 9th of September, and I know you have that in your archives. It doesn't say where that speech was given, but according to my memory, it was given at Nuremberg to all of us who were involved in the trials, the legal staffs, prosecutors, the guard element, the officers of the guards, and the military intelligence people and people like me. And he explained the purpose of the trials to us. And I quote him in my book. And that quote in my book comes from memory out of the speech he gave, I think it was on the 9th of September, that you have in your archives here. And that is what he stressed was to prevent future aggressive wars, illegal aggressive wars, where one nation invades another nation and violates its territory, enslaves its people, commits genocide. A violation of a treaty or a non-aggression pact is a crime against the peace. Now, heretofore, that had never been established. No one had ever been tried for a crime against the peace. And Justice Jackson had been criticized, and so have all the prosecutors, for trying these men for crimes against the peace when it was had not been previously established. But Justice Jackson said such laws are made at the expense of human beings. And he pointed out also between the lines and in fine print that if you're going to punish somebody who has committed a crime against the peace by breaking a treaty and committing genocide, and you have to catch them. In other words, don't go to war unless you win. If you don't win that war, you're not going to punish anybody.
In an effort to try to fill out the mosaic of Justice Robert Jackson, we invited Professor Henry J. Abraham of the University of Virginia, a renowned scholar on the Supreme Court and among the foremost writers of our day. That jumps out from your mindset when it comes to Jackson, when you say Robert Jackson, that preeminent piece of literature, what would it be?
Well, it would be West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett. That would jump out at me because of his magnificent language in the case and his dissenting opinion in Korematsu versus the United States, you know, when he said that guilt is not inheritable, guilt is personal, and that Korematsu cannot escape from the race into which he was born. And in the West Virginia case, that was just wonderful, you know, and I've quoted it twice last night and once this morning when he said, those who begin coercive elimination of dissent will soon find themselves eliminating dissenters. Compulsory unification of opinion achieved only the unanimity of the graveyard, you know. I would always think of that. But there were many others. And then, of course, post-Nuremberg, his famous dissenting opinion in the Chicago case involving a fascist group, Gerald L.K. Smith's group, when he said, unless this court commits itself to some common sense, it will turn the Constitutional Bill of Rights into a suicide pact. I'm going to quote that on Saturday when I'm on a panel about free speech in wartime, you know, and so forth.
Speaking of Korematsu, the Robert H. Jackson Center and Chautauqua Institution collaborated in having Fred Korematsu, the man who defied the military orders that sent Japanese Americans to internment camps during World War II, spoke on September 26, 2002. Fred Korematsu, who refused to obey a law that President Roosevelt had set forth imprisoning Japanese Americans in internment camps in San Francisco area. The case went before the Supreme Court in 1944. The court affirmed President Roosevelt's ability to issue such orders. However, it was Justice Robert Jackson, in a memorable dissent, said, he stated that if there is any fundamental assumption underlying our system, it is that guilt is personal and not inheritable. Fred Korematsu was born an American, raised as an American, and merely the fact that he has Japanese parents should not be enough to incarcerate him.
Yes. Hello, I'm up here in the back. Hello, Mr. Korematsu. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. I am a teacher, and I brought my class with me. And as an impressionable group of young people, and you were being described by so many as an activist, is there something you'd like to leave with them, or some message that you'd like to have them take away with them?
I heard you. Yes, I would. To believe on the Constitution, and also anything that's within rights. If you think you're right, and go along with it, and to fight it, you know, to not give in. Like I knew, you know, it's against the Constitution what they're doing, and you know, even though You know, like here, you know, like I say, hey, what we're doing here is poem. And I don't hear anything about the rest of it. So maybe they're right, you know, and I'm wrong. But I'm going to find out. So stick to your guns.
Mr. Korematsu on this historic day was film producer Eric Fournier, who had just received 2 Emmys for his documentary on Mr. Korematsu entitled Of Civil Wrongs and Rights.
A number of things have struck me. One, that you can make a difference. You can, if you stick to your guns, that as Fred always says, if you believe you're right and you believe that your fight is moral and just, no matter how long it takes, you can win. The also thing that strikes me is he's never had or exhibited an ounce of bitterness towards the government, towards what he had done. You know, if anything, you know, the phrase that he believes the government, he should have pardoned the government, still in and of itself is not infused with any sort of bitterness. It's still sort of a moral stand. He's always felt he was an American. He's always loved America. He doesn't hate America for what they did to him. He just knows it was a chapter that was wrong. It was something that needed to be changed. And that that's what I came away with. And that's what I was trying to get across when I said about the growth of America. There's that phrase in the film about Lincoln saying that freedom is America's unfinished business.
That's right.
Well, I think Fred helped us finish that business a little bit.
From left to right, James Marsh, Murray Gardner, and Phil C. Neal. Clerk for the 1943 and 1944 term for Justice Robert Jackson, Mr. Phil C. Neal.
Less talk between Jackson and other justices about the business of the court. Certainly prior to a conference on a case, than was true of maybe some others. I mean, it may be that Murphy and Douglas or Murphy and Black talked more about cases. But Jackson, by and large, I think, pretty much wrote his own vote. I mean, you've doubtless heard from others about the motto that Jackson had over his fireplace, in a framed, embroidered something or other. He travels the fastest who travels alone.
In the spring of 1945, Phil Neal left to go to San Francisco and was replaced by Murray Gardner, who completed the 1944 term and was there for the 1945 and 1946 term as the law clerk to Justice Robert Jackson.
Jackson was a complex personality. He was not a simple man. Again, I think a lot of the people who might have written biographies are put off by the fact that he's described as a country lawyer. They think, oh, well, you know, what can there be there? He was just a country lawyer. Of course, he liked to describe himself as a country lawyer because in one case, I think it was Frank Hogan, called him a country lawyer, and he grabbed onto that and said, well, that's great. I mean, I'm proud to be called a country lawyer, and of course it may disarm some of my opponents if they think they're coming up against a country lawyer. He was no country lawyer in the sense that he was a hayseed. He was a very, very intelligent, brilliant man.
For the 1947 and 1948 terms was James M. Marsh.
And we talked about Roosevelt, we talked about Nuremberg and all that, and well, I thought the time was running out. I said, no, I have to tell you, Mr. Johnson, I had an ulterior motive in coming down here. I wanted to talk to you about the falsification of the clerkship. So he said, well, I've talked to some people, but I haven't made any commitments. So he said, you know, send me an application, send me some references, and we'll see. So I, of course, knew who to ask to be my references, and I said the other day, I read those letters that sent supporting me recently. I didn't recognize myself. I don't think if I could be that smart at that age. But he got the stuff and he called me back for a second interview. And at that time, he right on the table, he said, you know, you give me a problem. He said, if I hire you, we'll be running these chambers without one college degree. I have no degree. Mrs. Douglas has no degree. You have no degree. And I've always felt that my lack of formal education hampered me in my writing. So I said, Mr. Justice, every judge and every lawyer in the country knows you're the best writer on this court, college degree or not. And if there's one thing I can do is write and rewrite and edit writing, I've been doing it all my life. And I said, you can find lots of guys that know more law than I do, but I don't think you'll find anybody who can do that job any better than I can. So if that's the kind of guy you want, and somebody will be, I remember saying I had a flair for people and for politics, be fiercely loyal to you, I'm your man. So shortly after, I got a letter saying he'd offered me the job and told me about the pay scale. The basic scale was $4,221.
The clerk for Justice Jackson during the 1949 term was Howard C. Bushman, Jr.
And yes, he was known for his fluency with the language. One of his best thing that he ever did was a concurrence. As he wrote it, concurring and dissenting, each in part. That was CIO v. Dowds, Dorsey, and that was it was a dissent. And but anyway, this guy had been, I think it was a disbarment case, and he used language, somebody else's language, and they were saying he was plagiarizing. But I should not like, oh, yeah, I like this. I should suppose that so far as the law is concerned, one may as effectively father statements by adoption as by conception, and that sincerely subscribing to what another has written for him does not constitute legal deceit or ground for disbarment, impeachment, or other penalty. But I like that. You could father statements by adoption as well as by conception.
During the 1950 and 51 term of the United States Supreme Court, the clerk for Justice Jackson was C. George Niebank, Jr.
Well, now, at the court, once Justice Jackson once said to me, he said, "No, George, this is early on, after you've been here a while, you may be somewhat disillusioned," he said, "but I just want to warn you in advance." And I saw what he had in mind. It's like 9 law offices in one building. And they're not like they're partners or anything, but 9 law offices, and they've got a job to do, and they do it. Like lawyers, you know, that's nothing unusual about that. Although each with his own style, of course. Now, of all the justices, the one that Justice Jackson was closest to, by all odds, was Frankfurter. You know, which is an interesting combination, the country lawyer and the Harvard professor. But they got along marvelously well.
Was Jackson deemed at that time to be a terrific writer?
Oh, yes. He was, that was one of his most prominent skills.
Mm-hmm.
He was, I would say, certainly one of the best writers on the court in the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And he was fun to write with. I did a lot of that.
Yeah.
And he liked to do it. There'll be more about that.
Current Chief Justice William Rehnquist was Justice Jackson's law clerk during the years 1951 and 1952.
In those days, the idea of flying back from Stanford, California to Washington, D.C. for an interview to see if you wanted to be, if you would be accepted as a Supreme Court lawyer was virtually unheard of for people of ordinary student means. And, you know, to take the train for several days, you wouldn't do either. So people really on the East Coast, at the East Coast schools, had a much better chance of getting, if the justice wanted an interview, a much better chance of getting the job just because they could, it was manageable to come from Boston or New Haven or New York and even Chicago. And so when one of Justice Jackson's previous law clerks, Phil Neal, who was then teaching at Stanford, asked me if I'd ever thought of clerking at the court, I said no, I hadn't. And he said, well, you know, I clerk for Justice Jackson. Justice Jackson's come here to dedicate the new law school. Would you like to interview with him if he comes? And I said, sure. And so Justice Jackson, when he was out at Stanford, interviewed me. And I mentioned in the book that as soon as he discovered that I was of Swedish extraction, he regaled me with tales of some of his Swedish clients in Jamestown, New York. And I thought, surely, you know, that he'd just given up on me. That it was just making me feel good. And then several months later, I got a letter from him saying, well, would you like to come and be my clerk? So I did.
A co-clerk with Chief Justice William Rehnquist was Donald Cronson, who joined us in Jamestown making a special trip from Switzerland in 2003.
And I remember my first day I reported for work. That's another conversation I remember, among the many that I forgot. But the one I remember on that occasion was that he explained to me that he had come up as a young lawyer in upstate New York, where he interviewed the client, he collected the facts, he did the legal research, he prepared the pleadings, he did the trial brief, he conducted the trial, he made the post-trial motions, he submitted the briefs. If there was an appeal, he submitted it, he tried the trial. You know, it was his method of working was he would be the guy who did everything. He said, I was the despair of some people in the Justice Department, because even when I got with all those hundreds of lawyers, I still had a tendency to just mark out certain things where I was going to do it mainly myself and just only loosely look after what was being done by the others. And he said, now, on this court, I'm the guy who's going to do the opinions. That doesn't mean I'm not going to ask for your help, but that's going to be my responsibility. You and Rehnquist are the guys who are going to look after the cert petitions. Now, that doesn't mean you can do anything you want to. I'm going to check what you do, and we'll talk about it. But that's your responsibility, and that's the way it's going to work. And with a few exceptions, that's the way it did work.
Justice Jackson's last clerk for the years 1953 through 1954 was E. Barrett Prettyman, Jr.
And I think that a part of the legacy also is simply his rise. I mean, when you take a lawyer, a Democrat in Republican territory, doing what you do in a town like Jamestown, which I would guess that while there are business cases, an awful lot of it was wills, trusts, and estates and things of that sort, and see his rise from that through the various steps, Solicitor General, Attorney General, Supreme Court Justice, Nuremberg. That's amazing. I mean, that takes more than just a glib tongue. That's force of personality and intelligence in the best sense. He was not an academic, and I don't mean to put academics down, but that was not how, he was not a Frankfurter. He was a very practical man.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for watching Time Warner Cable 8 News on this Friday, May 16th, 2003. I'm Mark Ashgarian.
And I'm Casey Bortnick. Nice to have you with us.
Topping the broadcast, the United States Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist makes a stop in Jamestown today to honor his former boss.
Rehnquist pays his respects to Justice Robert A. Jackson today as he delivered the keynote address during the official dedication of the Jackson Center. The country's highest-ranking member of the judicial branch, 78-year-old Supreme Court Chief Justice William Rehnquist in Jamestown, to dedicate the center established as a legacy to his former boss, Robert H. Jackson. Rehnquist served as Jackson's law clerk in the 1950s and became a quick study of his work.
But what strikes me most about his court work was his masterful use of the English language. What makes this mastery truly impressive is the fact that Jackson had no formal education beyond high school, except a year at the Albany Law School. And certainly law schools are not places known for their teachers of great English prose style.
Rehnquist says although Jackson was instrumental in domestic cases, including a legal opinion regarding the separation of power between the country's 3 branches of government, that's still cited today, his greatest achievement was his work prosecuting Nazi war criminals following World War II.
Jackson said that his Nuremberg role, quote, was the supremely interesting and important work of my life, and an experience which would be unique in the life of any lawyer.
Rehnquist says Jackson's application of international law during the military tribunal was courageous despite criticism in the United States and overseas.
Whatever the merit of these objections, the Nuremberg trials were surely superior to the summary court-martial proceedings favored by some members of the administration, and the summary executions initially favored by the British.
Chief Justice Rehnquist highlighted Jackson's work as the chief prosecutor during the Nuremberg war trials in the 1940s. Although Rehnquist says he was fascinated by the proceedings, he wasn't eager to ask Jackson about the experience due to the controversial nature of the war trials.
So I studiously refrained from asking him anything about them. But one day, a friend of mine whom I'd known at graduate school was down visiting me. And then he said to Justice Jackson, well, I'd never dared say, how do you justify the Nuremberg trials? There was this guy, 25 years old. Well, Justice Jackson went into a 10 or 15 minute eloquent justification of the Nuremberg trials. He actually welcomed the question, and I was pleased there to be in the audience just to hear it.
Rehnquist, who was elevated to the position of Chief Justice in 1986, served as Jackson's law clerk for a year and a half before the 82nd U.S. Supreme Court Justice passed away in 1954. Rehnquist says although Jackson's gone, his legacy of the American ideal of fairness and justice is something Chautauqua County should be proud of.
Surely Jamestown and Chautauqua County can be proud of the career of their native son on both the national and the international scene.
Well, after the speech, Rehnquist attended a lunch reception at the Chautauqua Institution where he was made an honorary member of the Norden Club, established for professional gentlemen of Swedish descent.